My name is Chris Eliasmith, and I'm the director of the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at the University of Waterloo. And I'm actually jointly appointed between philosophy and engineering. The philosophy allows me to consider general conceptual issues about how the mind works. But of course, if I want to make claims about how the mind works, I have to understand also how the brain works, and this is where engineering plays a critical role. Engineering allows me to write down equations and very precise descriptions which we can test by building actual models. One model that we built recently is called the SPAWN model. This model SPAWN has about 2.5 million individual neurons that are simulated in it. And the input to the model is an eye, and the output from the model is the movement of an arm. So essentially it can see images of numbers and then do something like categorize them, in which case it would just draw the number that it sees. Or it can actually try to reproduce the style of the number that it's looking at. So for instance, if it sees a loopy 2, a 2 with a big loop on the bottom, it can actually reproduce that particular style of 2. On the medical side, we all know that we have cognitive challenges that show up as we get older. And we can try to address those challenges by simulating the aging process with these kinds of models. Another potential area of impact is on artificial intelligence. A lot of work in artificial intelligence attempts to build agents that are extremely good at one task, for instance, playing chess. What's special about SPAWN is that it's quite good at many different tasks. And this adds the additional challenge of trying to figure out how to coordinate the flow of information through different parts of the model, something that animals seem to do very well.
There's another one. There's supposed to be another one.
The thing that drove me was this question, right? How does the brain work? And sort of the engineering part of me at some point just took over and said, you know, well, it's a whole bunch of little devices, and we actually know a fair amount about how each of those individual devices work. SPAWN is a model, so it's a piece of software, and what we're trying to do is simulate how the brain functions. So just like you might simulate a circuit, a digital circuit or something, we want to make sure that each of the devices, which in the case of the brain is a neuron, is simulated properly. So we write some equations down that describes how it functions, and then we put hundreds or thousands or millions of them together and make them communicate in a way that is appropriate to reflecting the kind of structures that you find in the brain and to performing some specific function which we know that the brain performs. On the medical side, it gives us an understanding of how biology actually results in cognition, right? So what is it that neurons are doing together to give rise to people being able to remember lists of items, for example? And so we can think about what kinds of interruptions at the biological level, so what kinds of diseases, might change some of the behaviors that we observe. In recent work, we have taken out some of the very simple cells and replaced them with much more sophisticated cells, where the neurons actually have spatial structures. And what this lets us do is new kinds of experiments with models like SPAWN. So for instance, we can essentially virtually introduce a drug. And because SPAWN has very high-level psychological functions, even though we're introducing them at the biological level, we can look at the effects at the behavioral level. We can't do this now, but at some point we may be able to scan your brain or do some behavioral tests, and that will let us build a model which is specific to you. And then we could actually tailor the kinds of neurological interventions to the things that we know about your own brain. On the more technological side, when we're building models like SPAWN, we're actually sometimes getting functions out which are not very natural for computers to do. If we extract those functions and put them into machines, then we have to start worrying about, how we're going to interact with those machines, what kinds of machines we do want to build and we don't want to build, and other sort of sociological questions about what happens if those machines start taking over a lot of the jobs that we typically expect people to do. All of the simulation tools that we built, all the models that we built, all of the designs for robots and so on are things that we just released to the public. And the reason is that what we'd really like to do is to have not only our lab, but many labs around the world adopt these kinds of methods, so we can build something like a grand unified model across many labs, across many countries. Because I ultimately think that's the only way we're going to be able to tackle the kind of complexity that we observe in the biological brain.
So I think there are a couple interesting things in there for us and for our purposes. And we kind of started out this whole section on minds and machines by looking at the science fictional example of, humanoid robots, Hubots. and whether they might have a mind and real consciousness. And I think this type of work really shows a couple of things. I mean, nobody would want to say, I think, that this model, and this is not a physical thing, right? This is just a program, a simulation of some aspects, still fairly simple aspects of human cognition. Nobody would want to say that this literally already is intelligent or could pass the Turing test or anything like that, or has consciousness. But the direction in which this type of work is going to be very biologically inspired. We here have a simulation of some aspects, and those could get more and more of the human brain, including interaction with the world. So simulated body parts, something like an arm, right, being able to copy numbers in a certain way. We have something that might have reminded you of Descartes' test of intelligence, right? Spawn, according to Chris Elias-Smith, isn't yet a universal problem solver, but it's also not dedicated to individual, highly specific problems like chess. It can really learn. It can do numerous different types of things, so it's kind of working towards the universality. And if this develops more, and that's why I wanted to show you the second clip as well, this type of thing might be specifically important, not just to understand what is important and works well about human cognition, right, human optimal functioning, and doing that even better, but also trying to understand what goes wrong when it goes wrong, right? Cognitive decline, various disorders, aging, that type of thing. And at some point, as Chris Elias-Smith was saying, it might become possible to simulate that on the level of individual brains. So this would be kind of one way of taking this technology and not just making a scientific contribution, but also using it for therapeutic purposes and maybe making life better for individuals in important ways. So this is kind of where things are going. And what I'm going to do today throughout this lecture is, again, very similar to what we've been doing over previous lectures. So you now have the Chinese room, you have the thought experiment, and I will be walking you through selected objections that Searles himself discusses in the paper and how he responds, but I'll be doing that fairly quickly. And then for each of those, I'll be adding on an extra layer of saying this is how his critics respond, either responded back in 1980 in the original BBS paper that I told you about on Monday, or here is how this type of work, this type of thought experiment that we have in the Chinese room actually connects up to issues that are happening now in philosophy of mind, philosophy of cognitive science, and work on artificial intelligence. And then we'll see in what ways that thought experiment has turned out to be wrong, but maybe productively wrong in important ways. So that's kind of going to be my message here. So just to briefly remind you, we had seen that the Chinese room targets not weak AI, so it's not primarily denying that AI can have any contribution to the study of the human mind, but it's attacking the stronger claim that anything like an artificial mind or an artificial intelligence would literally have a mind, would literally be intelligent, or would literally contribute to the explanation of human understanding. So it's saying cognitive, this type of robotics, artificial intelligence, isn't literally a branch of psychology. Why is that the case? Well, that's the case because instantiating a computer program that works on purely formal symbol manipulation is insufficient for real understanding, for intentionality in this kind of technical sense that we were talking about in the second half of Monday's lecture. And for the same reason, because that's just the way Turing machines function, passing the Turing test is also insufficient for saying that something really has understanding in any rich sense of the word. So that was very much supposed to be the idea behind the Chinese room, show that the Turing test and the whole kind of research project behind it is misconceived and overly simplistic. It's focusing on the wrong thing. We had then looked at this technical concept of intentionality, and we had seen that intentionality, in the sense that Searles is interested in, so real understanding, real semantics, real meaning, is very much about the power of minds to be, or mental states to be about something in the world, like a little arrow pointing outside of the head to something else. That can be a physical thing in the world, that can be an imagined thing, an imaginary world, a theoretical claim. But it's something, there's something about minds that gives them the ability to have content, right? To have real meaning. And with that, with the types of propositional attitudes that you then can get, right? Not just on the level of individual concepts, but whole propositions, beliefs, wishes, desires, you now suddenly also get properties like truth or falsity. How does the content of a proposition match up to the world or vice versa? So that gets us into interesting territory, and many people in the past thought and still continue to think that intentionality, aboutness, content is really one of the great mysteries in thinking about the mind, and that that is really something that only minds have, and that also characterizes all mental states. So that intentionality is really the key problem for philosophy of mind. What kind of intentionality? Intrinsic or original intentionality, not the type I might attribute to something else by just saying, here's a meaningless squiggle, and I now stipulate that this has such and such a meaning, but original intentionality, that's where it's supposed to come from. So that's supposed to be the key problem here, and that will be a useful concept to keep in mind. And then we had contrasted that, I had walked you through this as well, with a slightly different aspect about the mind by saying, well, mental states not only have content and aboutness, they also have something like subjective or phenomenal character. There's some subjective quality for the subject of experience to be in a certain state. There's something it is like to be in a pain state, and that is characteristically different from having ticklish sensations and so on and so forth. And that is another mystery, how mental states come to have this qualitative character. And where I'd left you with was this point. And this is an area that I want to briefly talk about before I talk about the objections to the Chinese room, because I think this is another way of saying how, or of raising a challenge for functionalism. So we'd considered the idea that it seems possible that the color spectrum for some individuals can be inverted, right? Where you see red, this other person, invert, sees blue, and so on and so forth. So all of the colors that you see are differently distributed for that person. But that person is still going to be using the same words, is still going to be having the same emotional reactions and all of that, same intuitions about which colors match and which ones don't. And I had asked you to think about why this might be a problem for any theory of mind that either says, well, mind can be reduced to behavior or behavioral dispositions, or more importantly for the theories that we've been discussing, functionalism and computationalism. It's all just function. Why might this be a problem? Or if that's too hard, did people find this compelling? Did you find it, could you think yourself into a situation where other people have radically different qualitative experiences from the ones that you're having, but they still behave in the same way? Or maybe you think that would be something that would somehow show up in behavior, that you could somehow find out. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because it's a weird thing to think about, right? It could be that for you, that your phenomenal world looks radically different from mine, and that we just never notice it because we're still using the same words, right? So, who didn't have that intuition at all that that could be possible, that we could have radically different color experiences but never be able to tell the difference?
It would still be just that kind of difference in perspective.
So you would kind of be saying, well, at some point there would have to be something that would show up. Yeah? On the level of maybe brain processing or subtle changes in behavior. Is that what, right? So then you have a core functionalist intuition on some level. Then you're saying, I don't buy the thought experiment. This isn't possible. Something is going to show up. If that's what you're saying, then we don't have a problem for functionalism. So that's exactly what people in that camp would respond here. This doesn't really work. We just think it works. But if we really look at the details, there would be a functional difference that shows up. In that case, we're fine. Right? But what if the switch does work? And if you can basically change just the qualitative character of experience, but everything else stays the same, then, and this is many people think this type of scenario is coherent. Not everyone, but many people do. If this type of scenario is coherent, then you're now saying something like, well, then you can fix. So don't worry about the details here. You can look at that at home. But the basic idea is going to be then you can fix all of the physical or functional or behavioral properties of a system, of a brain, and you can still change the qualitative character. And if that is true, then you can't reduce mental states, for instance, color sensations, to pure function, right? Then there's something that is left unexplained by function. Your type of reaction is to say, no, that's incoherent. And that might well be true. There are good arguments for that. But if you have this intuition that this switch is possible, then you're saying, and it never shows up on the functional or computational level, for instance, then functionalism is false. And many people think that this is a very powerful objection to computationalism, right? And this is slightly different from understanding. This is not Searles' point, but this is saying this is not about meaning and intentionality. This is about the subjective quality of consciousness. So that's why I wanted to give that to you. And this is a type of thought experiment that you can find going all the way back to John Locke, for instance. Questions? Then let's mess up the Chinese room. So the basic guideline, and I'll be going through Searles' own reactions, rebuttals of the criticisms and objections he discusses in the paper that you've all read quite quickly. But you're going to see that his reactions, his replies to these objections always hinge on two key assumptions. And you remember that the Chinese room was set up such that he has no prior knowledge of Chinese, put in slips of paper with squiggles. To him, they're just squiggles. He can produce or hand out prearranged slips of paper with other squiggles. And he does this purely by having this type of rule book that only tells him about matching shapes. It tells him nothing about what those shapes stand for. And he can somehow do this so well that to somebody outside of the room, it looks as if he had an understanding of what he is doing, even though he has no prior understanding of Chinese, and by going through this ordeal, also acquires no understanding of Chinese. So that was the way he set up the example. And now his response to the critics is always going to be guided by these two claims. So the one claim is always going to be formal symbol manipulation, as long as that's all it is, as long as it's just matching one shape to another without giving the meaning of what those shapes stand for. There is no real understanding. Syntax is necessarily and in principle different from semantics. No amount of syntactical information is ever going to give you information about meaning, is never going to give you real understanding. So that's the red one at the bottom. And then he's also going to say, in any type of approach that goes beyond pure formal symbol manipulation of that type that we see in the rule book and that we've also seen in the Turing machine is no longer AI. So he's also going to say, I have a strict and narrow conception of AI that only allows these types of purely computationally, purely formally defined operations. That's all that AI is. And we can already see that that's in tension with some of what is happening today, right? That today's program is kind of going way beyond this type of conception. So with that in mind, that's going to be the general strategy that he's just going to reiterate again and again and again. And the first, and this is probably the most famous objection to the Chinese room, is the systems response. So let's hope to make this clear to you if it's not already clear to you. So the systems response is going to basically say that Searle is mislocating or looking at the wrong part of the system when he's asking whether Searle in the Chinese room has understanding. So the way the Chinese room is set up is always just saying, does Searle in the Chinese room gain an understanding of Chinese? That's the question. And that seems intuitive because Searle is, of course, the conscious agent here that we've put in the room. So the way it's set up, it's natural to ask about Searle. But if we actually take a step back, the systems response is going to say this perspective is much too narrow. We have to look at the entire system. And that contains the room, but also the slips that go into the room and the internal processing and the slips that go back out of the room, right? The analog to the Turing machine is the whole thing. It's not just the rule book, in other words. It's really that input-output relation and the internal state. So that would be the true analog, if you think back to last week, that we need to be asking about. And this is a powerful thing to say. If that is correct, then you might want to say the entire system understands Chinese, even if Searle in the room, who is just part of the system, does not. Yeah? So that's the idea. And there's an important analog here that you might have come across if you read kind of popular literature on the mind and the brain, or have kind of dipped into cognitive neuroscience literature. There's a similar way of speaking that often occurs there, where people are often likely to say things like, well, and then some part of the brain decides to do such and such, right? Then a desire is located somewhere in the brain, in some area, right? Or you might have imagery, the mind's eye, right? Seeing happens in a part of the visual brain, and so on and so forth. So there are often ways of talking about the brain as if the brain itself, or parts of the brain, had mental states, desires, made decisions, and so on and so forth. And here the analogous objection would be to say, no, that's not true. No part of the brain literally understands or thinks or wants or desires anything. It's the whole person that does, right? I'm the person who makes the decision. Neuronal processing makes some contribution to that. But no part of me is going to be a real bearer or possessor of mental states. It's whole persons that do these things. You can't attribute mental states that belong to the whole system, me, an embodied self, to part of the system. So this is the type of thinking that is going to be behind the systems response, right? This is to mislocalize mental states. Is that clear? So mereological is just saying it's a part-whole fallacy. You're attributing a property to part of the system that can only meaningfully be attributed to the whole system, the entire system. Yeah? And again, some people think it's perfectly fine to say that part of the brain understands. But a powerful view in philosophy is going to say that this does not make sense. Clear so far? Okay. So what Searle is going to do, and this is a nifty strategy, is he's going to try to get rid of the apparent distinction between part and whole. And how is he going to do this? He's going to do this by collapsing the whole structure of the Chinese room and internalizing it in his head. So he's just going to say, okay, good. So there's a part-whole problem here, system versus part of the system. So we're just going to imagine that Searles, because he has these wonderful, memory powers or something like that, learns the whole rule book by heart. He's internalized it. And so there is no physical room, there is no physical rule book. It's all in Searles' head. And this is what enables him to give out the Chinese responses. Everything else stays the same. But even if we collapse this distinction, we've now gotten rid of the part-whole difference. But the problem, Searles is going to say, persists because it's still just formal symbol manipulation. It's still just the rule book. And that's still not going to be enough for understanding. So that's the way, his main way to deal with this objection. And I think that there's a nagging worry here. There's a nagging worry here. So this is where Searles ends, but you might add another level of complexity. You might want to say, okay, good, so it's not about a smaller part versus a larger part of the system, but isn't it at least conceivable, and this is something that Ned Block says in response to the Chinese room, isn't it conceivable that you could have different programs running on the same machine, an English language program and a Chinese language program, running on the same person in this case? And isn't it at least conceivable that they would have each their own understanding and their own experience, but not be aware of each other, right? So this is again saying, no, there are still parts of it. There could be real understanding thanks to the rule book in Searles, even the type of Searles that has internalized the Chinese room and the instructions and all of that. But English-speaking Searles might not be aware of what Chinese-speaking Searles is aware of. So that will be the strategy. And you might think that this sounds really weird. Like, why worry about this? So I'm going to give you one example of how this might not be completely weird. People heard about split brain patients, right? So split brain patients, the corpus callosum, so basically the bridge between the two hemispheres has been severed. And they have some really interesting, show some really interesting types of phenomena. You can look at the video online later. But the key point is going to be this. So if you look here, you can show a patient, a split brain patient, a word on the right side of the visual field. So you show it to the right eye, and that means it goes to the contralateral half of the brain, to the left half of the brain, which is the language area. So then the patient can say, good, I can read out the word, no problem. And now the weird thing happens when you switch the sides. So now you're showing the word to the left eye. It's going to the right half of the brain. This is not the language half of the brain. And because the two halves of the brain aren't communicating with each other, the patient now no longer can say what word they are being presented with. But weirdly enough, they can draw it. And they're going to say, look, I have no idea what you're showing me here. I can't even guess at the word. But they're going to produce a drawing that is correct in many cases. So this is really, really weird. And you might not, people literally don't know quite what to say about this, right? So should we say that each half has their own experience? Even if the patient can't report on what the one half of the brain is experiencing, maybe we still want to say that there's real understanding and experiencing happening in the half of the brain that just happens to be dissociated from the language-producing part. After all, the patient can draw what is going on, apparently, in that half of the brain. Right? So if you feel the pull, this is open for debate, unclear, but if you feel the pull of that type of approach, if you think it's at least possible that half of the brain is experiencing something and has some kind of continued intelligence, then you're siding with block, right? Then the Chinese system that Searles has internalized might have real understanding. So that's the idea here. How is that? So think about it. Or anything unclear specifically? I mean, this is a confusing lecture because I'm giving you many different positions here, but this is a real question. It's a really open debate, yeah? Okay, then I'll move on. Robot response, kind of the next type of objection that Searles looks at. And the objection is going to be quite straightforward. It's the gut reaction that, well, look, if you give a system the ability to actually interact with the world, not just through slips of paper, but actually, and this is something that the Turing machine didn't have either, right? It didn't have a body, it didn't have behavior, it didn't have social interaction. But if you endow a system with those types of things, then you get understanding in an interesting way. Interaction, movement through a social and physical environment. And Searles' response here is going to be predictable. More of the same. Same strategy that he's always going to have, right? He's going to say, well, again, formal symbol manipulation isn't enough. And more importantly, if you put, or more importantly, he's going to say you could imagine that, you know, the Chinese slips that he's handing out, unbeknownst to him, are actually somehow controlling a real body, a real robot. But Searles in the Chinese room isn't going to have any clue that this is happening because he still doesn't have understanding. So he might be an embodied robot for all he knows, but he doesn't have a clue. And therefore, again, purely formal symbol manipulation isn't going to be enough, no matter what you say. How would you push back against that? How would you say that Searles, if you wanted to criticize Searles here, what might you go for? And this is not to say that Searles is either correct, this is right, or that he's wrong. This is just to try and open up different ways of thinking about this, right? Different ways of pushing back and asking new questions about this type of thing. So the strategy is always going to be, well, okay, so this is his move in the chess game, right? What do you move? What do you do next? What could you do? If you think back to stuff that I was showing you earlier on in the minds section, given you the key for an objection here. Gonna skip over this next one. Maybe this will make it clearer. So this, keep the robot problem in mind and consider this. And this is really, it's a different word for it, the symbol grounding problem. But it's really the problem of how, it's really the problem of intrinsic intentionality and meaning that Searles is talking about. How do you get meaning into a system without arbitrarily assigning it to a symbol like we do with a stop sign or a meaningless squiggle? That's uninteresting meaning. We've just pointed to it and stipulated this is what it means. How do we get intrinsic, non-derived meaning into a system? That's the symbol grounding problem. And that's the analog to the problem of intentionality that Searles is concerned with in AI. Can you imagine who might say that this isn't much of a problem, thinking back to what we've been doing so far? No? You remember this guy, right? That type of setup, right? Give it a body, give it the ability to develop its own concepts, and to negotiate what they mean with other conspecifics, or maybe also with humans. Give it the ability to interact with an environment and to have social interaction. And it's going to generate new concepts and new meanings. And those meanings are going to be surprising. So you have Luke Steele's coming in and saying, hey, that problem, symbol grounding, intrinsic intentionality, is off the table. We've done that. And I think he's not, and he's going to appeal exactly to Searles' Chinese room. And he's going to say this was a problem back in the 80s. And then philosophers got all confused about it, but now we have actually done this with our robots, right? And again, you might not think that they're quite there yet. I also wouldn't quite agree that all those years of philosophical debate didn't make progress on this issue. I would rather say the philosophical problem identified, the philosophical debate identified the problem, and now people are finding other ways to deal with it and other ways to move forward with it, right? So you need a different kind of system, yes, one that has a different set of causal relations to the world, and maybe that way you can get meaning into the system. Okay? So here you can kind of see, hopefully, how these different strands are coming together. Yeah? Okay. Brain simulator response. This is the last one we'll look at, and then I'll move to some more general worries. Brain simulator response is just going to say, well, don't just look at pure formal computation. Actually look at, for instance, with neuronal networks, actually look at what the brain is doing. We need something much more like Elias Smith's spawn, right? Something much more empirically, neurobiologically plausible to get real understanding. And Searles is going to be happy with that. Part of Searles is going to be very happy with that, right? Part of Searles is just going to say, yeah, exactly. If that's what we're doing, then we're no longer talking AI, right? That's no longer the AI program that I was interested in. That was exactly my point. We have to understand the powers of actual brains to get to understanding, right? Pure symbol manipulation isn't going to do the trick. But then he's going to have this footnote by saying, well, but as long as you're simulating certain properties, namely purely formal properties of the brain, so that's the part where he jumps back to the second strand of response, then you're just doing more of the same. That also won't cut it. That won't be enough. And again, this could be, I mean, this is what he's going to say, but this could be too simple, right? This could, so for instance, I told you last week that there was this paper or a version of the Chinese room in the Scientific American, and here's the response by Paul and Patricia Churchland. Where they're saying, well, let's do reverse engineering and find out how the brain is actually doing this, right? You will remember that Searle had also said, well, I don't think that there is good evidence that anything in the biological brain is actually using formal symbol manipulation at all of the type that we see in artificial intelligence and digital computers. And you might just want to say that's more of an open question than we know. I'm not going to pronounce either way on that. Let's just figure out how it works. We take a finished system that we don't quite understand and try and figure out how that's done. And that's what we're doing with artificial intelligence. And maybe we can just conceive of it more broadly along these lines, right? And create meaningful artificial models that now aren't purely formal anymore, but still tell us interesting things, right? That could be real progress. And I think that this is very much the way in which the field is developing. If that is true, then Searle will have still highlighted an important limitation in some parts of artificial intelligence, right? And highlighting that limitation might have been exactly the way to move forward in a meaningfully different way, right? So that might be one way of saying, even if he's wrong, that some kind of wrong and some kinds of artificial system do have understanding, maybe that has been an informative type of wrongness. How are we doing so far? Have I totally killed you with information at this point? So I'll jump over this one. And I want to end the last couple of minutes with some general thoughts on thought experiments, because this is something that we've been doing. We had a conceivability argument in Descartes, right? I can conceive of my mind as being independent of my body. We had it in the Turing test, so that is a test that can actually be done and not just thought about. And we had it in the Chinese room. So one worry here is what kind of method is that, and are we using it well? And again, there's a debate on this, and there's no fixed position on it, but it's interesting to think about the strategy. So here are Paul and Patricia Churchland again from the paper that I mentioned earlier. And they ask us to do a bit of time travel back to the 1860s. It's just been discovered that light and electromagnetic waves are identical. And now they ask us to imagine somebody who does not like this theory at all. Somebody who wants to argue that it's just absurd that light is identical with electromagnetic waves. And this person asks us to imagine the luminous room. So now we get the artificial luminance argument, yeah? So you have a dark room, put a man with a magnet in it, and get the guy to wave the magnet around really, really quickly, generating the electromagnetic waves that supposedly are identical to light. But now we all know that just waving around a magnet very quickly doesn't do anything, right? That's not going to illuminate a room at all. And from this you conclude then that it's now inconceivable and thus false, our critic says, that light is actually identical to electromagnetic waves, because you can't generate it by going into a room with a magnet. What would you tell the skeptic? If you're Maxwell and you want to defend your theory, you want to say, well, okay, we now have a thought experiment that shows supposedly that my theory is wrong, that waving around a magnet doesn't get you light. How would you link this to the Chinese room? Is this a serious problem for Maxwell, this thought experiment of artificial luminance being impossible because the luminous room just won't work? Do you think Maxwell has to be worried about this? This is a mean objection to Searles, right? Or can you see how this is? Yeah. So you would say, so you would side with the critic? In that case, they seem identical, but the thought experiment shows that they're really not, because some kinds of electromagnetic waves, namely waving around a magnet in a room, don't do it. No? So that's a Searles-type response in some ways, right? That is to say, the analogy in Searles here is to say, well, a Turing machine can look like it has intelligence, but it's not the same thing. Yeah? Good. Any other views on that? Not expecting right answers. This is a live debate. This is a live problem. So what they're going to say, what the Churchlands are going to say is this. This is a little bit mean, but this is what they're going to say. They're going to say, here's the argument behind the luminous room. They're going to say, well, start out with the assumption that electricity and magnetism are forces, that light is essentially luminance, just as intelligence is essentially understanding. But then we show through the luminous room thought experiment that waving around the magnet isn't going to be enough to create it. So therefore, we have then shown, if the luminous room argument is correct, we would have shown that electricity and magnetism are not constitutive of nor sufficient for light. And the analog to the Chinese room that they then continue to develop is this one here. Programs are purely syntactic. Artificial intelligence works only with formal symbol manipulation. But human minds have something else, not luminance, but semantics, intentionality, understanding. And now even doing syntax very quickly is never going to be enough for semantics, for real understanding. So being a program is never going to be enough for having a mind. So you can see that the objections are completely analogous, right? If this works. Supposedly the arguments are working in the same way, and the Churchlands are going to say this is a horrible argument, right? So they're going to undercut the whole strategy. They're going to say the problem is the red-coded one is just already assuming what is supposed to be shown. It's begging the question. It's already got the conclusion that the person wants to argue for, the critic of Maxwell wants to argue for, written into it, and that's not a good thing to do. That's cheating. And in the very same way, they're going to say that Searles' argument already has as a premise that syntax is not enough for semantics, and that is just assuming what his argument is supposed to show, but he can't know that yet. So Searle is cheating in much the same way as the proponent of the luminous room argument is also cheating. And so they're going to doubt that this type of thought experiment, just like waving around a magnet in a dark room, doesn't really tell you anything about light and luminance, they say. They're going to say that the Chinese room can't tell you anything about intelligence either. So they're going to be doubting the whole strategy. That's what they're doing. That's why this is kind of mean, because the magnet waving thought experiment is quite preposterous in some way. Is that clear? So the worry in the background that I just want to give to you without pronouncing on it is how we treat these kind of thought experiments in general, and whether they're a good way to generate knowledge. And the only message that I'm really going to give you here is that you need to be very careful with these types of thought experiments. So Dan Dennett calls them intuition pumps. They're designed in such a way to pump out certain types of intuitions. And those intuitions, those knee-jerk, those gut reactions, right, the immediate feeling, that's absurd, Searle wouldn't understand Chinese. That's something that the story is designed to pump out of you. But sometimes it's really worth looking into the background and seeing how if you kind of turn the knobs on a thought experiment and make subtle changes, well, could Searle internalize the system? Does it have to be pieces of paper? Could it be digital? Could he be controlling a body? Could he be doing it more quickly or more slowly? Is the system very big or very small? Sometimes by changing those small details, you're also going to change your intuitive reactions to them. So it's really important to pay attention to those details, even though many thought experiments are going to work by kind of leaving them out. Now, Dennett's own view is that the Chinese room disables your imagination, right? It tells you a plausible story, but it actually manipulates you into accepting the conclusion. I'll leave this one open. That's up to you to decide. But it might be interesting to go through this kind of exercise and try and think about how you might change the thought experiment to change your reactions to it. What might you take from this? Well, you might take from this, and this is where we started out, if you remember the science fiction story at the beginning of the mind section, that maybe intuitions about minds are generally not very great. It seems quite weird when you first think about it that the brain is the kind of thing that can generate real understanding too. That's also a weird and somehow strange thing to assume. So maybe our intuitions about mindedness are just bad, and maybe some kind of additional evidence is needed. So maybe we can start out with something like the Chinese room and then make it better, and then maybe we need to actually gather. And this would be something that I personally think would be a good strategy. Maybe we then need to try and overcome those challenges by looking at actual robotics, actual cognitive science, actual artificial intelligence, and drawing all of those fields together with philosophy. Maybe that's the way to go. But you might disagree with that one. So to end, where do we stand and why have we done this? Because this is the end of the mind section. We've come a really long way, and we've looked at all kinds of different theories here, and we haven't really hit on anything, I think, that really gives us the final answer about mind and intelligence and thinking. But what I hope to have done here is to have given you some understanding of the key concepts and the key problems. So if you've understood what the problems are, and if you feel confused and that you don't know what the answer is, that's already most of what I wanted, right? Because then you've already got a conception of what the real issues are here. And if you've found some new ways of thinking about this stuff, or maybe changed your mind about something in the process of it, that will be success, right? Then you've gotten what this was about. So that's what I hope to have done. This is the last lecture that I'll be giving you. Paul will be back next week with personal identity. If you like this stuff, there's a whole unit on it you might be interested in next year. And I think with that, we're done. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this. I did.
Yes. I guess yesterday, by the time just doing sort of 4 weeks here.
Huh?
4 weeks in ATS something or other. What are you teaching?
This is time, self, and mind. Okay. I just finished.
It's quite difficult for time, self, and mind.
Yeah, this was a bit trying to connect it to kind of stuff in AI and robotics.
Right.
And just give them a taste, like, look, this is what's happening now. Probably they're really confused.
I was curious about that. Do you know why those monitors aren't working? It's probably because the display mute. They keep changing the settings on these.
That's weird, because I had to... Did you hit the thing on top? It wants to be...
Okay, that's the start. Good, thank you.
That's really weird. I don't know.
Yeah, that's all right. Who knows how these rooms work? Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Bye-bye.